Hi guys, it's Paul Salazar at Hilton and Hyland. Thanks for watching. This is part of our buyer series. We're going to be discussing inspections today. This is a huge part of the escrow process. The biggest part of the escrow process is investigating the property, investigating all the disclosures, the title, all that stuff. So we're going to go over all that here in today's webinar. If you guys haven't seen any of my webinars, or if you guys don't know me, I'm Paul Salazar. I'm an agent here at Hilton and Hyland in Beverly Hills. I've been here for about 11 years. I've been selling real estate for the last 14 years here in Southern California. If you guys want more tips about buying real estate, selling real estate, investing in real estate, or if you just want to reach out to me or follow me, I got I'm on Instagram at Paul Salazar Group. I'm also on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on all the social media channels as well. All right, guys. Well, let's get right into it. So let's talk about, if you're a buyer and you're going to be purchasing a property, either a condo, a single family residence, duplex, fourplex, whatever it is, you definitely want to take this, this part of the transactions very seriously. It's your due diligence period. This is when you investigate what you're purchasing, right? So if you're buying, any kind of asset, you always want to inspect it just to make sure that there's no red flags. There's nothing that's going to bite you in the butt later on after you own it and you can't back out of the deal. This part of the process is an important time for you to look at everything, including the seller disclosures, looking at everything that has to do with the physical inspection. We're talking about reviewing the title report, getting insurance quotes, all the transaction docs, right? So here I have here HOA docs, CCNRs. If your property that you're looking at purchases in a condo community, you want to look at the HOA docs, right? You want to make sure there's enough reserves, in the HOA. You want to make sure there's no restrictions that you may not like, right? Because if they only allow one pet and you got two pets and you buy the place and you now have two pets, guess what? You're probably going to get fined. Or if you want to lease out the property and you're an investor and you're buying in a condo complex and there's a restriction that says there's no leases for the first year, right? To make sure that there's no investors buying in it. You want to make sure as an investor you're not buying into that condo complex. Or if you want to Airbnb it, the same thing. You want to make sure that you understand everything about the property. That way there's no surprises after you close escrow. And this is your time to really look into everything so that if you don't like anything, you can pull out of the deal, right? And get your deposit back. Your deposit is not at risk until after you remove all your contingencies. And this is the main one right here, is your due diligence period. Also talk about insurance claims, right? You want to find out if there was an insurance claim because of a leak upstairs that affected either your house or if you're in a condo, there's a leak upstairs and there's an insurance claim. You want to find out, right? So there's that's part of the clue report. How many days do you have for inspections? The amount of days on the purchase contract is 17 days. But since right now the market is very competitive, you might have to shorten those days down to 14, 12, or 10, or even less than that, depending on how hot the property is. I usually like to reduce it down to 14 or 12 days. That will give me at least 2 weeks to schedule all the inspectors. Right now, because the market is so hot, inspectors usually are booked out a week in advance, right? So I always like to, recommend my clients some of the top inspectors in Los Angeles, and a lot of those inspectors are full for a week or two sometimes. So even when I'm, in negotiating, for a client in the beginning, even before we go into escrow, before it's a fully executed contract, I will actually call my inspectors and say, hey, I'm probably going to get the, put this deal together, and I want to make sure that I reserve you on time so that we're not wasting time, right? So, ask your agent how many days, they recommend, to inspect the property. I'm here in Los Angeles, working in the Beverly Hills area and the West Side, Santa Monica area, and it's really hot market. So, if you are in a multiple offer situation and you're a buyer, you want to look you want to look good in front of the seller. So you may want to shorten that due diligence period, from 17 down to 12 or 14 days. So consult with your agent, ask him about that. All right, so let's get right into what are the property inspections out there? Like, what can you inspect in the property? Well, the physical inspection is the most important one. That's just an inspector that's gonna look at almost all the systems in the property and give you an overall view of what's going on with the property. He'll point out a few things here and there. He's not going to be an expert in foundation or roof. He won't be an expert in electrical, but he'll have a good sense of all the major systems in the property. And if he sees the roof that has some issues, he's going to say, hey, I recommend getting a roofer over here. I recommend getting a foundation, a structural guy. I recommend doing termite. I recommend getting a plumber, electrician, all that, right? So he will, he or she will be, usually the first inspector to inspect the property. And after that, you may want to hire other inspectors. When I'm selling, properties over $2 or $3 million, I always like to recommend my client, let's get all the inspectors in, spend $5,000 to $10,000 on inspections. If you're buying a $2 million property and you're spending $10,000 on inspections, that's not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things. I know that, a lot of buyers don't want to spend the money on inspections, but this is the most important thing to do when buying a property. And not only that, but if you do have any issues while you do your inspections, like say you find mold, you say there's a lot of termite issues, you go back to the seller and ask them for either a credit, a price reduction, or for them to actually make the repairs. But we'll go over that in a bit. So you got the general. Structural, there's not a lot of structural inspectors out there, but there are a few, and they're actually quite expensive. But they'll check, the entire structure. They'll make sure that the foundation is solid. They'll make sure that it's earthquake retrofitted. They'll go underneath the house and they'll make sure everything looks good. There's no major cracks and all that stuff. And they'll provide a report. All these inspectors here that on this list will provide a report, and some of these inspectors will actually provide an estimate based on their findings. Not all of them will. Usually the general inspector will not. The structural, they may, depending on the inspector. The roof will definitely give you, an estimate. And you don't have to get a roof inspector. I actually do have a roof inspector that I recommend to my clients, but he's quite expensive. So sometimes, I say, hey, if you don't want to spend, $1,200 to $2,000, $1,200 to $2,000, get your roofer out here and have him check it out and just give you an estimate on what has to be done. My roof inspector really takes his time. He's there for 3 or 4 hours and really looks into everything. A roofer may just look, real quick and just say, here are a few recommendations, and they may not be able to write a report as good as a roof inspector does. Termite, that's pretty popular inspection right now, or has always been here in California. There's a lot of termites in California, so it's not uncommon for us to see termite issues. And it's never really a deal breaker unless they're all over the place and the house is falling apart. But usually, if the house hasn't gotten fumigated in the last 10 years, they might say, hey, we recommend getting this whole house fumigated. And that's an easy thing to do when you're about to close escrow, because the sellers are moving, you're going to move in. So, right before close of escrow or even during escrow, you can have that termite fumigation done right after the sellers move out. Nobody's in the house, it's vacant. And then you assure yourself there's not going to be any termites, and there's usually a warranty for 1 or 2 years. But most termite companies are going to recommend that you get a fumigation, which means tenting your entire property for 2 or 3 days every 10 years. Okay, and after that, you can come back into the house and just do your thing. You don't have to move anything. You just have to leave the house and have them tent it, and then they'll come back. They'll come back and take the tent out, and you can move in. Right after. You don't have to wait as you did it in the past. Asbestos. There's obviously houses that were built back in the day that have asbestos in a lot of the different systems. And a lot of houses have asbestos, and we don't even know. So sometimes people are sensitive about these, these kind of, things and hazards. So they want to get those inspected, and that's completely fine. It's not a very popular inspection, asbestos, but there are inspectors out there that will make sure that they, look for things, or they know what materials are made out of asbestos, and they'll give you a quote to, remediate that work or those items that have asbestos. Sewer line repair. sewer line inspection. 100%. If you're going to buy a single family resident, get a sewer line inspection. You know, you never know when that sewer line is full of roots. There's a crack in the line. The line is sagging. So you don't want any of those things. You always want to get a sewer line inspection. And what they do is they come in with their camera, and they just put, you know, a camera all the way down the line. It's not that, you know, that expensive of an inspection, probably between $300 to $500, depending on where the sewer line's at in the house and how easy it is to access it. But definitely recommend the sewer line inspection, and they usually give you a quote on the cost to repair it. The general inspection, you know, I didn't tell you guys, but it's probably going to be in between $500 to $2,000, depending on how big the house is. A structural inspection, anywhere between $800 to $2,000. A roof inspection, again, you can get your local roofer or a roofing contractor to do it for free, or he might charge you a couple $100. Or if you get a roof inspection by a professional, sometimes they charge you know, a lot of money. My guy charges around in between $1,000 to $2,000 for a roof inspection, but he's really good. Termite is a very cheap inspection, anywhere between $150 to $300 or $400, depending on the size of the house. Asbestos, that can range. I don't know exactly what the price is there, so I don't want to give it to you. Sewer line, again, in between $300 to $500, depending on where the sewer line is at and how easy it is to access it. Fireplace inspection, again, I definitely recommend this. The only problem with a fireplace inspection is that a lot of fireplaces have issues. It always comes up in almost, I would say 90% of the houses or condos I sell that have an older fireplace. There's always going to be either it was installed incorrectly, or there's a crack in the flue, or something that may cause them to say you have to replace the entire chimney, the entire fireplace. I always recommend it, but I always, you know, disclose to my buyers beforehand that just know that a lot of fireplaces have a lot of issues, but people still use them and there's no issues, right? You know, they don't have any hazards, but you never know, right? So it's always good to inspect it and know what the potential risks are in any of these, you know, items here for inspections. Foundation, again, this is kind of similar to the structural. They're going to make sure that the foundation looks good. They want to make sure that there's, you know, there's proper drainage around the foundation as well, because you don't want, you know, water coming in down into your house. Foundation can be anywhere between $500 to $1,500, depending on the size of the house. Site drainage, there's inspectors that will do foundation and site drainage. Site drainage is also really important. You don't want, again, like I said earlier, you don't want water coming into your house and it's underneath your house, and it's going to cause mold. It's going to cause issues over time. So you want to make sure that the house is properly, you know, it has proper drainage throughout. Flat properties, you know, as well as hillside properties, I always recommend getting a site drainage inspection. And again, this is in between $500 to $1,000, and they'll just walk the property, they'll measure it, they'll see where the elevations are, and they want to make sure, hey, if it rains a lot, is this house properly, you know, there's proper drainage around to make sure that the structure is not, you know, the integrity of the structure is going to be fine if there's a heavy rain or there's multiple, you know, days of rain. Okay. Also, just, you know, say there's, you know, you have, you're on a hillside and you don't have proper drainage. You know, that hillside can fall down if you don't have proper drainage, right? So you want to make sure that you inspect all these things. Mold inspection. Mold is really popular, you know, inspection. A lot of people are conscious of mold and are very, you know, susceptible to, you know, that any kind of mold issues for their health, right? So always recommend getting a mold inspection. They cost anywhere between $500 to $2,000, again, depending on the size of the house, depending on if you want to get samples. You know, you can either do air samples, right? So they have a machine and they'll take an air sample in any specific room, a bathroom, a hallway, you know, bedrooms, kitchen, anywhere you want a sample in, or they may recommend, you know, where the samples should be taken, and they'll take a sample outside so they have a reference to see, all right, outside is this and inside is this. It seems about right. So, you know, we're not going to say that there's any mold issues. If there's a leak in the ceiling, if there's a leak in the wall that you can't physically see mold, but it's maybe behind, right, behind the wall, they can take a sample. So they'll just drill a very small hole the size of a dime or even smaller than that, and they'll take it to the lab and get that tested. When that is the case, there's usually going to be mold, right? If there's a stain there that has been there for a long time, there's probably a leak that had run down the wall in front and maybe behind the wall as well. And if it's behind the wall, there's no ventilation back there. So when there's no ventilation and there's water, that usually creates mold. So a lot of people freak out when it comes to mold, and I say just look at the inspection, follow what the inspector says, and sometimes you might have to take a chunk of the wall off and replace it. It's very, very simple. There's always, in my experience, in my 14-year experience, there's probably going to be mold somewhere in the property, either a condo or a house, maybe underneath the sink. There's a leak there, and that happened years ago, and there's a little bit of mold there. So just check it out, talk to your agent, have a discussion, but don't get freaked out if there's a little bit of mold in the house. All these things can be remedied. Elevator. If you have an elevator in your house, if you're fortunate enough to own a house that has an elevator, get an elevator inspection. You don't want to be stuck in an elevator and then you're in the elevator and you can't get out. That wouldn't be a good thing, right? Or if you have kids, you don't want them in the elevator and for some crazy reason it stops working. So get an elevator inspection. A soils inspection. If you're on a hillside, if you're close to a beach or certain properties, highly recommend getting a soil inspection. Just to make sure that the earth is good, it's not going to shift. You're not going to get any shifting in the foundation of the structure. You're not going to see a landslide or liquefaction. Excuse me, on that. So soil is very important. This can cost anywhere between $1,000 to $2,000. Again, depending on the site, they can get quite expensive. A fire, a sprinkler. Depending on the house, if there's any issues with that kind of fire sprinkler head, a lot of fire sprinkler heads actually have been recalled in the past and they've never been replaced. So that's happened to me once before, where the general inspector looked at the fire sprinklers and saw the model and said this model was recalled back in the 90s or however long it was. So he recommended getting those replaced. And that can be quite expensive because the fire, all the fire sprinklers have water inside them. So you have to drain the system, replace the heads, the fire sprinkler heads, and then test it out again. So again, highly recommend that. If your general inspector sees that the fire sprinkler heads that are currently in the property are either bad or they've been recalled in the past. Geological inspection, again, just like the soil inspection, very similar. If you're in a hillside property, if you're down the beach, if you're anywhere where there's landslides, like in Malibu, there's been some landslides in the past, always get a geological inspection. And these are also, quite expensive, in between $1,500 to, up to $3,000, just, depending on the house and the inspector. A permit expert. You don't always have to get a permit expert to look at the permits, but if there's any permit issues with the property, highly recommend it. So I just recently closed a property in Hancock Park where the seller built a pool and they added, in addition to the house, they added square footage, and they got the permits, right? They went to the city and their contractor did all this work to get these permits, and the permits were never finalized. They were issued, they expired, but they never finalized. If the permits are not finalized, that means that the permit is not in the system, right? So you always want to make sure whatever contractor you guys hire for a pool, a kitchen remodel, adding a bathroom, expanding the square footage of a house, adding any kind of structure, anything that needs a permit, make sure you get a permit for that. You don't want to be selling your house and start disclosing to the buyer that there was no permits done for this or this, right? That's always a red flag. As a buyer, it's always a red flag when you see permits that have not been finalized. You have to ask a question like, why wasn't this permit finalized? So in the case of the Hancock Park listing purchase, when I rep the buyer, we requested that the seller get these 2 permits finalized, and they got it done. It took about 2 weeks, and an inspector came back out just to make sure everything was done correctly, and they got the final stamp of approval. And now when my clients end up selling that house in 10 or 15 years, and the new buyer asks for the permits, they can go on the city website and it'll show them exactly this pool was permitted, the extension of the house was permitted. So this is very important, also to make sure that there was nothing done without permits, right? Because you don't want to be buying a house and they added all kinds of, added an extra bathroom, added an extra room, they expanded the house, they put in a new roof, and nothing was done with permits. The reason why we have permits is because the city knows the standards that are set in place, the building standards, right? So if you do the roof, add a bathroom, add square footage to your property, and you don't get permits, most likely that seller, if they didn't get permits, they were too cheap, and they didn't want to go through that permit process, or they hired somebody that said, hey, I'll do it for X amount cheaper than the other person, but I'm not going to get permits. Or some sellers just don't even know, right? But it's always important as the buyer, or if you're an owner, always get permits if you're doing any work. It's very, very important. Earthquake retrofit. Also, this is kind of same as the foundation, as the structural. Since the Northridge earthquake in '94, there's been some upgraded earthquake retrofit standards. So you want to make sure that the house is retrofitted for the modern earthquake, whenever that's going to be. But you want to make sure that the house is structurally sound. If an earthquake happens and it's a big earthquake, the house is not going to just fall off its foundation or going to slide down the hill or collapse, right? So you want to make sure that you get this inspection if the general inspector recommends it. A septic, if you're in Malibu or in different parts of Hollywood Hills, there are septic tanks. So if there is a septic tank and it's not under public sewage, always get a septic inspection. There could be a crack in the septic tank. It might not be draining correctly. So always get a septic inspection. These are not that expensive, anywhere between $500 to $800 for a septic inspection, depending on the system. HVAC. I always recommend getting an HVAC for any single family house, because this can cost you in between $5,000 to $10,000 if there's any issues, right? If the HVAC system is not working correctly and you need a whole new condenser unit, that may cost you $5 or $6 grand installed. So you want to make sure that you understand what you're buying, right? So that when you close escrow and the AC doesn't work after a month, well, hey, I inspected it. The inspector said there was a few months left in the life of the AC, and at least you buy the house knowing that you're going to have to fork up the $5 or $6 grand or whatever it takes to put a new system in there. Pool inspection. If you're buying a pool, again, if you're buying a house with a pool, always get that inspected. If it has a spa, get the spa jets inspected, the filter, the pump, all that. Again, if these systems, any of these systems here that I have here on the page, if any of these systems, if there's anything that goes wrong with them after you buy the house and you weren't aware of them, then you could have a case to go after the seller and say, hey, you did not disclose that there was foundation issues, blah blah blah, right? So the seller has to disclose any issues that are going to affect the value of the property. So that's why you also want to get all the inspections, because you can't always rely on what the seller is aware of, because the seller may have forgotten that there was an issue 3 or 4 years ago, right? I mean, they honestly could have forgotten that. So that's why you spend the $3,000 to $10,000 on getting inspections, because at least you know what you're buying and you're not relying on the disclosures from the seller. And the seller just may not know. They may not know there's a roof issue. They may not know there's a mold issue, right? Because they're not sensitive to that. So again, highly recommend getting a lot of these inspections, but talk to your agent. They'll know exactly what to get, all right? So preparing your request for repairs. This is what I do when I'm representing a buyer, right? Once we do all the inspections, so right here on the right, again, this is just an example of what I do. We did termite, we did sewer line, fireplace, roof, foundation and side drainage, HVAC, pool, and we also got contractor estimates on the general inspection, because usually the general inspection, the general inspector will not give you bids on the findings that he found at the property. So then you have to get a contractor to look at the report and give you a ballpark estimate on those items that he noted. So here we found a little bit over $300,000 on a $5 million house worth of repairs, right? So what do? You know, you can first you get bids on all the repairs, and again, some of the inspectors are going to provide those bids for you. The next thing you do is you want to review the bids and discuss with your agent. You don't want to go to the seller and say, hey, I want you to fix everything, unless it's a buyer's market. You know, right now it's been a seller's market for the last 10 years, right? So, or actually more like 8 years. But you know, in today's market, if you're dealing with other offers or other buyers, you don't want to be too strong on your request for repairs, right? So always consult with your agent, ask them what they think is the right move, right? So for this house, we paid top dollar for it. You know, we went straight at asking price, and we said, hey, you know, we went at asking price. There was no other buyers that made a bid. You know, we want you to make these repairs. Sorry, we want you to reduce the price based on the repairs we found. Okay. So that's one way to do it, right? You can ask for a price reduction, which is, you know, say if you buy it for $5 million and there's 327,000, then we want to reduce the purchase price to, you know, 4,663,000 or whatever that number is. Or you can ask for a credit, right? So, you know, if you're getting a loan and you don't have too much cash to make the repairs, you can say, hey, you know, why don't you reduce the price by $5,000, or actually, no, why don't you just give me $5,000 so I can make the repairs myself after close of escrow, and then you get a check at close of escrow for those repairs. And this is good, again, for buyers that are, you know, that have a loan and they don't have the cash to make the repairs. Talk to your lender and ask them what the max is, because it's based on the loan amount. The lender will usually say, okay, we'll give you a certain percentage, maybe 2%, 3% of the loan amount for repairs, right? And if you know, say there's more than that in repairs, say there's $50,000 in repairs that are needed for this house, and the lender only says we're only allowed for $25,000, then you can do a price reduction on the $25,000, and then the $25,000 credit at the close of escrow. The next thing is you can ask the seller to make the repairs. I don't like to ask the seller to make the repairs unless they're small, really easy repairs. I always recommend the buyer to make their own repairs with their own contractors, because if the seller hires somebody and makes the repairs, right, you don't have a warranty on those repairs. I mean, you should ask for it, but whoever pays the contractor is the one who has the power to call that contractor and say, hey, you didn't do a good job here. Come back here and get this done right. As the buyer, if the seller makes the repairs and you're the buyer and there's issues, you know, from those repairs, and you call that contractor, they may say, you know what, you're not my client. You didn't pay me. You know, I got paid from the seller. If you have any issues, call the seller. You don't want to deal with that, right? So always be careful when asking the seller to make the repairs, right? Consult with your agent, ask them what they think. So those are your three options when requesting any kind of either credit, price reduction, or repairs from the seller after you do your due diligence. All right, how to prepare a request for repairs. You don't really need to know how to do this. This is your agent's job, but I just want to show you how it's done so you understand what we have to do. Right here on the left is a request for repairs page, and there's a few sections here. You know, it says here, buyer requests that seller prior to final verification of condition, repair or take the other specified action for each item listed below. So this, if you check this box, you're basically asking the seller to make certain repairs, or you can have them look on addendum number 1, which is what I did. So on addendum number 1, you can see here that we asked the seller to reduce the purchase price down to $4 million, right? And we've also attached all the reports and estimates. I always attach all the reports and estimates on my request for repairs, because once the seller has those in hand, he has to disclose it to the next buyer if you cancel. So that's more leverage for you as the buyer. So make sure that your agent, when they send the request for repairs to the listing agent, that they include all the repairs, all the estimates, right? And I also like to include my spreadsheet of all the numbers, right? If termite costs this much or this much. So we basically send them this spreadsheet on a PDF along with all the reports, so they understand where that number is coming from. You don't want to just ask for some just random number and say, hey, these are just based on the repairs, but we have no proof of that. We just came up with this number in our head. You don't want that. You want to have evidence. You want to have proof that these repairs are going to cost this much by this licensed contractor. All right. So here on the left, request for repairs number 1. You can also check here for termite, for section 1 or section 2 termite. 1C talks about the credit, like I was telling you about earlier, and section 1D talks about reducing the purchase price to a certain amount. All right, so that's how you fill out the request for repairs. And that's it, guys. If you guys have any questions, let me know. The due diligence period is extremely, extremely important. Take it very seriously. The good thing about that period is that you can do all the inspections you want, and you can back out of the deal, and you still get your whole deposit back. It's after your inspections, after you remove your contingencies, that's when your deposit is at risk, and that's when, if you want to back out of the deal, you will lose your deposit, right? Unless the seller is willing to give it back to you, which doesn't usually happen because you just wasted 3 or 4 weeks of their time. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I am very easy to get a hold of. You can either call me, you can email me, you can send me a DM on Instagram, on Facebook, on LinkedIn. I am here to help out. I'm here to provide value. If you guys like this, share it with your friends and colleagues or your family. And I look forward to talking to you soon.